This year, I decided to make a little reading project out of quote-unquote rereading, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's in scare quotes here. Quote-unquote rereading the Old Testament prophets in the Bible, otherwise known as the latter prophets, so Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, who I will not list in extenso, but who include Jonah and Joel and Amos and Malachi and Zechariah and so on and so forth. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about my own experience reading the Bible, because it's fairly extensive, actually. So I myself am not a religious person. I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I've been to a church for an actual religious service, and not for like a memorial service or something. And they were all sort of tagging along with someone else who was religious, who I was just going along with, not for my own benefit. So I'm not a religious person. I identify as an atheist, but I've always been very curious about religion. I've always loved learning about religion. I find it fascinating. And so naturally, when I was in college, that drew me to wanting to read through the Bible. When you are in the United States, in a country like the United States, definitely has obviously a very strong Christian presence, and when you're sort of culturally Christian, as I would sort of acknowledge myself to be, I celebrate Christmas and this sort of thing, you get curious about reading the Bible. And so in college, I made a strong effort to try to read through the entirety of the Bible, just out of my own curiosity, really. And it was a tough experience. I had a lot of stopping and starting with the Bible. So what would always happen with my attempts to read the Bible is I would always start at the beginning. I would always go back to Genesis and see how far I could get, basically. And I tended to run into kind of a wall, I want to say around the 1/3 mark the way through the book of Exodus, because I think that's right around where the text in Exodus transitions from the story of Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues and all that, and transitions from that into the law-giving parts of the Torah or the Pentateuch, and transitions into those 600 plus, however many there are, commandments that are in the Torah. And those parts of the Bible, for someone who's not reading the Bible with any interest in doctrine or anything like that, because again, not religious, those parts of the Bible are extremely difficult. They're extremely challenging to get through, because I can't really give on the other reason that because they're boring, right? It's commandment after commandment after commandment, right? That's what most of the latter half of Exodus is. That was what most of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are. And so those books are a real barrier to entry for people like me, who was reading the Bible out of curiosity. And so I would always start at the beginning with Genesis, get partway through Exodus, and then hit a wall. And so what that means is that I've read the book of Genesis like 10 times, and I have always loved the book of Genesis. That's the thing. I love the book of Genesis. I love the stories in it. I think they're so fascinating. There's some fascinating characters in the book of Genesis, and I've always loved it. But eventually, I did manage to push myself through the rest of Exodus and the other books of the Torah, and made it to book of Joshua, then the book of Judges, then 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and so on. And those books of the Bible, where you have story of Joshua, story of Samson and Delilah, story of King Saul and King David and King Solomon, I loved those parts of the Bible. I still love those parts of the Bible. And so what you can probably get from all of this is that my primary interest in the Bible was in the parts of the Bible that told stories, right? That's why, I love Genesis, I love the first part of Exodus, I love these parts of the Bible like Joshua, Judges, and so on, where there are stories being told. And with the New Testament, that meant that I very much focused on the Gospels and the book of Acts. And so I really gave short shrift to books of the Bible that were not necessarily about storytelling. And that includes, Leviticus and books like that, but I think more importantly, books like the Psalms, like Proverbs, like Ecclesiastes, even Job, which does have more of a story, but I wasn't very interested in the story, I guess. Even Job, I wasn't super interested in. And, of course, the prophets, right? The latter prophets and the 12 minor prophets. Very much not of lesser interest to me in my reading of the Bible when I was reading it in college. And so that's why I put rereading in scare quotes, because I always tell people that I have read the Bible. That's what I always tell people. But it's always kind of with an asterisk, because I honestly am not sure that I did properly read the Old Testament prophets when I read through the Bible. I'm not sure. I don't think I did, but I may have tried to plow my way through them. I'm really not sure. And so this reading project for me is I'm doing it for a couple of reasons. The first of them is a little bit of cleaning up duty, right? I want to be able to say that I have read the Bible without an asterisk. I want to be able to say that I have read the Bible, that I'm at least familiar with it on a single reading, if not multiple readings. And I have since done that with other parts of the Bible that I gave short shrift to. I have reread Ecclesiastes and Job and the Psalms, and I have really come to appreciate those parts of the Bible, not even so much for their wisdom, although there certainly is wisdom, but just for their poetic beauty. I've become much more interested in the inherent beauty of language in poetry. And there's a lot of that in many books of the Bible where there are no stories being told, like the Psalms and so on. So the first reason for my rereading of the prophets is to just do a little bit of housekeeping, to actually read the things that I usually say that I have read. But the other thing is, because I have come to appreciate the literary merits of the non-narrative sections of the Bible, right? Again, rereading the Psalms, reading Ecclesiastes and Job, reading some more of the New Testament, and so on. I've really come to appreciate the Bible much more as a work of literature, I think. Not just as a work of story, but a work of literature, the actual language. And for me, that language is almost always conveyed through the King James Version. And so this is a Penguin Classic of the Bible. The Penguin Classic, just the title on the front is just the Bible, but the translation that's in here is the King James Version, which for me is kind of the only English version of the Bible that matters. And I say that intentionally with some hyperbole, because I know that there are other English translations that are more scholarly, more accurate, and of course there are Jewish translations as well that are important, and so I say that intentionally hyperbolically. But for me, in terms of just savoring the language of the Bible, there's really nothing, as an English speaker, there's nothing like the King James Bible. So I wanted to develop that deeper literary appreciation for the Old Testament prophets. Okay, and then there is a final reason that I was drawn to reread the prophets from the Old Testament, and that's because this kind of chorus of voices started to coalesce around the prophets as a work of literature that was really important, not only in a literary sense to a lot of writers I love, but also to a lot of people who had a lot of progressive ideas about social reform. And where the seed got planted for me for this was when I read David Blight's great biography of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, I'm certain most of you are familiar with, but he was a 19th century activist and writer and speaker who was a former enslaved man who escaped slavery and went on to become an orator, an activist, a politician, and so on. And one of the issues he was primarily cared about, as you might imagine, as a former slave, as a black American man, was abolition, was the abolition of slavery. He was also very involved in the women's suffrage movement, and so on. But in this biography of Frederick Douglass, something that I learned was that Frederick Douglass very much was inspired by the Old Testament prophets. He very much kind of invoked them in a literary sense in his speaking, in his literary influences, but also just in his attitude, right? Because a lot of what is the Old Testament prophets write about is the Israelites' failure to follow God's commandments, but in particular, with regards to those commandments, their failure to see to the poor, to take care of the widow, as is often said, and the children, and to take in the stranger, right? And how they treat slaves. Actually, that's touched on a couple times as well. And I imagine that was particularly important for Frederick Douglass. And in particular for Frederick Douglass, it's from what I remember, it was particularly the book of Jeremiah that was really important to him, because Jeremiah is known for speaking particularly strongly about the treatment of the needy, right, and so on and so forth. And Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, sorry, I was blanking on the title for a second. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is often referred to as a Jeremiad, right, which is sort of a little subgenre itself. I mean, it didn't invent that genre, but so Frederick Douglass very much invoked the Old Testament prophets in his speaking, but also in his attitudes, in his progressive ideas. I also in recent years read through the complete poems of William Blake, who wasn't so much an activist, although he did have a lot of revolutionary and politically progressive ideas. But I read through his poems and just loved them on a literary level, on in the power of the language and the imagery he evokes. But what was interesting for Blake, for him, there was this strong literary influence of the prophets. And I feel like for Blake in particular, there was an influence of the prophet Ezekiel. I would need to reread Blake and maybe look up some more about Blake's influences to verify that. But I feel like I got really Blake vibes when I read Ezekiel this time. So there's a literary influence, but and in the sense that Ezekiel has all these visions, right? And so many of Blake's larger poems are these visions of revolutions that will happen, like often involving these divine beings. And as I want to talk about, Ezekiel touches on those things as well. He has visions of divine beings coming down, right? But also, William Blake, too, had, as I mentioned, a lot of sort of what we would now call progressive social and political ideas. He was very excited about the French Revolution and the possibility of democracy there. He was very excited about the American Revolution and the possibility of democracy in America. And he also was kind of what we might call now a bit of a feminist. I mean, he believed in women's rights. And he was also a believer in the liberation of sexuality. Not in terms of sexual orientation necessarily, but he believed that sex is something people should be able to enjoy out of wedlock, basically, which was a pretty radical thing to think in the late 18th and early 19th century. So he too had a lot of these progressive social ideas, and again was very much inspired by the Old Testament prophets. And then the last kind of writer who came across my radar who wrote about the prophets was someone who I haven't read yet. I hope to someday. I haven't yet because the book is really large. But Abraham Joshua Heschel was a Jewish writer who wrote a great book about the quote-unquote Old Testament prophets. He wrote a book called The Prophets because for him as a Jew, they're just the prophets, not the Old Testament prophets. But he wrote a great book, a well-regarded book called The Prophets. And my understanding is that in it, he kind of reads these prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and others, as arguing for progressive social reforms. And Abraham Heschel himself, my understanding is, was a big supporter of the civil rights movement in America, for example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. And so that was kind of the last straw that got me to finally give these books a reread. So that's kind of the coalescing of my interest in rereading these books. There's kind of an interest from a literary standpoint, from the literary influence of these books. There's kind of the political attitudes espoused in them. And there's just, I get interested in reading the influences of people who I find interesting, like Frederick Douglass and like William Blake. And so I want to now proceed into reading just a few really notable passages from Isaiah. So Isaiah, I think Isaiah, in terms of the literary merits of these parts of the Bible, I think that Isaiah takes the cake. I think it's the most poetically beautiful of the Old Testament prophets. One of the most poetically beautiful books in the Bible, for sure. And you can see why so much of Isaiah was used for the libretto of Handel's Messiah, right? Especially chapter 40 of Isaiah is used a lot in Handel's Messiah, right? O thou that tellest good tidings to Zion. That's taken from Isaiah 40. And he shall feed he shall feed his flock like a shepherd. That's from Isaiah 40. And there are other famous verses from Handel's Messiah that are in Isaiah 40. But I want to read just some verses from Isaiah that I thought were particularly beautiful that aren't Isaiah 40, because I assume most of you know those lyrics and love them like I do. So I want to read some other lyrics that I think are beautiful and have been influential that aren't that. So I'm going to start with, this is going to be Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9. And here is that. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. And I love that image. The earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. And that image of the holy mountain as well, it recurs throughout Isaiah. I think that is just beautiful. Next verse I have written down here to read out is Isaiah chapter 24, verse 18. Okay, here we go. So here it is. And it shall come to pass that he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he that cometh up out of the midst of the pit shall be taken into the snare. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth do shake. Now, there's a couple things that made my ears perk up when I read this. For one thing, I'm pretty sure the shaking of the foundations, that last line, I'm pretty sure there's a famous book called The Shaking of the Foundations by Paul Tillich, which is about theology, which I haven't read, but there's a little bit of an influence there. But more deeply for me, more importantly for me, is that imagery of a pit. He who shall fall into a pit and come up out of the pit shall be taken in the snare. One of my favorite poems of all time is A Pit But Heaven Over It by Emily Dickinson. And that pit imagery, I wonder if it was an inspiration for her in that poem. She obviously would have been very biblically literate, given her upbringing, given the time she lived in, and so on. And so that made my ears perk up as well. And that pit imagery kind of recurs in the prophets, I think. So there's that. And then the last one I have from Isaiah is from chapter 55, and it's going to be verse 12. Okay, so chapter 55 of Isaiah, verse 12, here it is. For ye shall go out with joy, and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. And that imagery of the hills shall break forth before you into singing, again, it's just beautiful. You have this imagery of geographic features or plants breaking out into song, or clapping, right? All the trees of the field shall clap their hands. And all the trees of the field shall clap their hands also made my ears perk up, because it's the title of a song by Sufjan Stevens. He has a song called, I think it's called All the Trees of the Field Will Clap Their Hands, but it has to be a reference to this verse. It's from his album Seven Swans, which is a sort of an album about Sufjan Stevens' religious faith and has some of my favorite songs by him. So Isaiah, I think, takes the cake in terms of poetic beauty. If you've heard Handel's Messiah, then I probably don't need to convince you very much of that. But hopefully, if you weren't convinced, I have since convinced you with a few verses. Now, another interesting thing, moving on to Ezekiel. One thing that is so different about Ezekiel is how trippy Ezekiel is. I mean, right from the opening chapter, we have this really arresting passage in chapter 1, starting with verse 4, all right, where Ezekiel sees these extremely bizarre-looking angels. Okay, and so here's that passage from chapter 1. So I'm starting at verse 4, all right? So here it is. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it. And out of the midst thereof, as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Also out of the midst thereof came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and every one had 4 faces, and every one had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides. And they had 4, and they 4 had their faces and their wings. Their wings were joined one to another. They turned not when they went. They went every one straight forward. As for the likeness of their faces, they 4 had the face of a man, and the face of a lion on the right side, and they 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. They 4 also had the face of an eagle. Thus were their faces, and their wings were stretched upward. 2 wings of every one were joined one to another, and 2 covered their bodies. And they went every one straight forward. Whither the Spirit was to go, they went, and they turned not when they went. I mean, I'll stop there. I mean, that is an arresting image, right? These 4-headed angels with one head is a man, one head is a lion, one head is an eagle, and one head is an ox. And they have these wings that, it sounds like the wings don't even flap, right? It's this really arresting image. And you also get this image of a different type of angel at some point. That is a wheel with eyes. A wheel covered in eyes, So you have these really kind of unsettling images, these kind of awesome images. And I say awesome, not in the colloquial sense of like, oh, that's awesome, I love that, but awesome, like inspiring awe, And I think this says something important about like encounters with the divine, as they're explored in literature and in other works of art, that experiences of the divine are not always immediately beautiful and immediately rapturous and positive. Sometimes they are kind of dreadful. Sometimes they are kind of scary, and I think that this speaks to that. There's also later in Ezekiel a really famous and really fascinating passage about the Israelites being kind of reanimated. The passage sort of describes them being reanimated as sort of zombies almost. And it's supposed to be a metaphor for them being resurrected after the exile, I believe. And so you have these profoundly unsettling images in Ezekiel. And I think it says something interesting about what an encounter with the divine would be like. Because again, I don't think it's always immediately this rapturous experience with beauty, you know. So that's a little bit about Ezekiel. I now want to turn a little bit to the 12 minor prophets. So after reading Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and also Lamentations, I mean, those three books are so long, each of them, but also so powerful, so rhetorically powerful, and so fascinating to read, that I kind of expected the 12 minor prophets, by comparison, to be a little slight. I was sort of expecting to just zip through them and not think about them too much. But the 12 minor prophets turned out to be pretty interesting. I mean, they are much slighter, obviously. I mean, Joel is 3 pages long, and Haggai is 2 or 3 pages long. I think Obadiah is 2 pages long. Zechariah, I think, is the longest of the 12 minor prophets, and I think that's like 12 pages. Jonah is like 3 pages, right? So they are slighter, but they really are interesting in their own right, because they're so diverse in what they talk about and in their style and their approach. And what's so interesting about them as well, what's so interesting about the 12 minor prophets as well, is that one of them is Jonah. And the reason I say that's so interesting is because Jonah, the story of Jonah being swallowed by the whale and then spat back out, is so famous, right? People who've never opened the Bible in their lives probably know, at least vaguely, the story of Jonah, right? And so it's such a famous story from the Bible, up there with Adam and Eve, with the Passion of Christ, with David and Goliath, and so on. And yet, it takes up all of 3 pages of the Bible. In my edition, at least, it takes up 3 pages. It's such a short book of the Bible. But I can see why it's so famous, because it is really a powerful work, I think. It really stood out to me. And I think it would have stood out to me even if I wasn't previously familiar with how famous it was and how influential it was. And then there are a couple of things that I found so interesting about Jonah. So for one thing, it's just so much different from a lot of the other books. Certainly a lot of the other prophetic books. It's a lot different, insofar as it does at least have a little bit of a story, right? We open with Jonah at sea on a ship, and the ship is ravaged by storms, and the other members of the crew are wondering why that's happening. They think there must be that God must be angry with them. And Jonah kind of comes forward and confesses that God is probably punishing them because of Jonah, because Jonah had been told by God to go and prophesy in Nineveh, in the city of Nineveh. And Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. And Assyria was a longtime enemy of the Israelites. And so Jonah did not want to prophesy in Nineveh, and so had been resisting doing this. And so God was punishing the ship he was on, the crew of the ship, for having Jonah aboard. And so after Jonah confesses this, they basically throw him off the boat. And I love how pithy Jonah is, the book of Jonah is, when it talks about him being swallowed by the whale. Because all it says is, now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And that's what you get about him being swallowed. And then Jonah has this beautiful, beautiful sort of monologue about how he's repenting, how he feels bad, how he will go and prophesy to the Ninevites. And he gets vomited out after 3 days, vomited out of the fish. And then he goes and he gives probably the shortest prophecy in the Old Testament to the Ninevites. He just says to the Ninevites, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." That's all he says in his prophecy to the Ninevites, and they immediately repent. And the commentary that's in this edition of the Bible has a little bit of commentary in the back, and it comments about how that is probably meant to be like quasi-comic, sort of funny, that the Ninevites just immediately repent after one line of prophecy. But what the really powerful part of Jonah is in chapter 4, where he kind of has this dialogue with God. He kind of tells God how he hates what he's done. He hates the Ninevites because they're longtime enemies of the Israelites. And God just says to him, he responds to Jonah, what Jonah says, with just a question. And it's a really enigmatic question. He just says this. He says, "Doest thou well to be angry?" That's all he says. And he says it again a few lines later. And so the commentary in this edition is very enlightening on this topic. I think the takeaway from the story, again, based on some of the commentary I read and based on my own reading, is I think the idea here is that Jonah, as a man, as a human, his grace, the grace that he can offer, is limited by his human experience, whereas the grace of God is unlimited. Right? And I think that's the point here, is Jonah seems unable to offer grace to the Ninevites, but God can. And so God's grace is much greater than Jonah's. And I thought that was really powerful. But what I think makes the book of Jonah a little bit tragic is just a couple books later, in the 12 minor prophets, you get a prophet. I think it's Zephaniah, whose entire book is just prophesying the destruction of Nineveh. And so even though Jonah went and prophesied to them and they repented, we still have Zephaniah prophesying their destruction. And I think that just puts Jonah in a different light, that he didn't want to prophesy to the Ninevites. He did it sort of begrudgingly, but he hated that he did it. Then God sort of taught him this lesson about his grace, but then the Ninevites were destroyed anyway, So I found that really fascinating, and there's just a lot of layers there. And then the last point that I wanted to make, because it's a point that I make kind of a lot about the God of the Old Testament. So the God of the Old Testament, I think, justifiably has this reputation for being very unpleasant, and for being very unforgiving, and for being very violent. And that is not unearned by any means. He does tell the Israelites to commit genocide in Canaan. He does punish the Israelites repeatedly. He punishes many people repeatedly, sometimes seemingly arbitrarily. And there's this idea that all the God of the Old Testament is about is eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That the whole moral code of the Old Testament is that you pluck someone's eye out, then your eye will get plucked out, right? That tit for tat, that cycle of you do something to me, I'll do it right back to you, right? Or you do something, you go against a commandment that God has given you, God will come down in wrath and punish you. And we do see a lot of that. I mean, again, I'm not saying that's not true. But often, and it's pretty much always Christians who have this attitude, they portray the God of the Old Testament as being entirely about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and that's all God is in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we have Jesus come along and say, forgive people, right? Extend grace. Not everything should be about punishment and revenge. We should forgive people, right? And so the idea is that the God of the New Testament has sort of brought new wisdom, right? That we shouldn't just punish people for doing the wrong thing, and that we shouldn't do eye for an eye, but we should offer grace, right? And be open to repentance and so on. And based on my own reading of the Old Testament, and not just my reading of the prophets here, but my reading of the whole Old Testament, which again, I've read a few times, there is grace to be found in the Old Testament. There is forgiveness. And I think Jonah, the book of Jonah, is one of the most powerful examples of the Old Testament discussing this idea of forgiveness in some way. But it's discussed in other books of the Old Testament as well. I remember passages from the Old Testament prophets about how as soon as a person who has sinned repents, then God will forgive them. And on the flip side, as soon as a righteous person sins, then God will punish them, right? So there's two sides to it, right? Yes, God will punish a righteous person after they've sinned, but also he will forgive them as soon as they repent, right? There's a really striking passage in one of the prophets about that. And another thing about the Old Testament is that as vengeful as the Old Testament God can be, and as much as he does seem to follow this tit for tat, eye for an eye idea when it comes to his treatment of the Israelites, what I've always found really powerful about the Old Testament is that no matter how pissed off God is with the Israelites, he always takes them back. He always takes them back. He always lets them return. You know, he does do awful things to them to punish them, but at the end of the day, he takes them back. You know? And so I think that in a way is a form of grace that God extends to them. Because I think if God, the God of the Old Testament, were as vengeful and unpleasant as people make him out to be, he would have just destroyed the Israelites long ago. He would have destroyed the Israelites after the whole debacle with the golden calf in the book of Exodus, I think. So, anyway, those are my thoughts. I do have some aspects of these books that I couldn't get to, but it's 15, 16 books of the Bible. I can't cover every aspect of them. And I'm certain that even the aspects that I did discuss, I didn't really do a lot of justice to, unfortunately. But if you have any thoughts about the Old Testament prophets, please comment. I'm hungry to discuss these books. And yeah, I will leave it at that, and I'll see you all in my next video.